Welcome back, guys. So how to learn words in a new language part 2. First of all, I'm not going to waste your time. If you haven't watched part 1 of this video, pause the video, go check it out first because it's actually going to walk you through my method of learning words. If you've already watched it, excellent. Yeah, you can continue watching this one. So you should already know about the input repetition method. That is basically what I taught you last video, and this video will teach you the top 5 tips effectively to learn faster and build a larger vocabulary. So now that you actually know what you need to do to learn a language, I'm going to teach you kind of how to do that the right way and to not kind of make a bunch of stupid, not really stupid mistakes, but just to, do it better. Just trust me on this one. But yeah, like and subscribe, can't be bothered reading that whole thing, let's go. So number 1, comprehensible input. You might have heard this before, it does get used a lot in language learning. If you haven't heard it before, don't worry about it because I'm going to explain it. So comprehensible input is basically language that you partially understand but is partially unknown. So if I was to read you a sentence or a paragraph in whatever language you're learning and you understood the whole thing, it would be down here in the orange, current level of language proficiency. If I read you a paragraph and you understood jack shit, it would be in the purple, too challenging, you don't know any of it. If I read it to you and you understood some words here and there, maybe a few chunks here and there, but there were bits that you didn't understand, but you got a rough idea, you're like, okay, it's kind of talking about basketball, not really sure what this is though, that would be comprehensible input because it is somewhat comprehensible, but it is also partially unknown. So yeah, your input, whether it be books, movies, podcasts, I'm not going to read the whole shebang list that I usually do, should ideally be in the comprehensible input zone. And the reason for this is because this is the kind of the Goldilocks zone. It's where you make the most progress with language learning. Of course, if it's too easy, you already know all the words, so you're not really learning any new words. And if it's too difficult, it crushes motivation. You can still learn words with it being really difficult, but it's generally just better to have a stretch and not a strain, as they say, and stay in the comprehensible input zone. So try and find texts that are difficult to read. Don't get me wrong, it should be somewhat difficult, but not impossible, and you do kind of have a rough idea of what is going on. That's comprehensible input. That is tip number 1. Make sure you're getting your vocab from comprehensible input. Number 2 is study in context. But what I mean by study in context is don't just learn the definitions of words, of course you can do that, but also try and learn how words are used, not just like little bites of information. So I'll explain to you properly what I mean. I've got a picture on the next slide, but basically when you make your flashcards, for example, if I just copied a word in and then its translation in English on the other side, I would literally just be learning words. And whilst that is better than nothing, you actually miss a lot of a language because if you kind of have to learn a second language fully first to understand this, but the way people talk in different languages, even when you translate it, it's just different. Like people just talk in different ways. Like they use not weird, that sounds kind of rude, but like they use different sayings. That's a bad example. They just talk you just have to understand, right? They just talk in different ways. Like they say things that if you translated it, it would just sound weird. That's why sometimes when people come from Asian countries or whatever, for example, countries that don't speak languages anything like English, even when they speak in English, even when they're good at speaking in English sometimes, they still say things in like a weird order and just, it sounds like ChatGPT has written... I'm going to get cancelled for saying that. I'm not saying Asian people sound like they ChatGPT when they're talking. I just mean when people speak a different language and they learn English, they talk in strange ways just because people just talk differently in different languages. Just trust me on that one. So it's very, very important that you don't just copy words in flashcards, but you also copy whole sentences, chunks, and that kind of things, and actually study in context because that gives you an idea of how people actually use the language subconsciously. It's actually putting it into your head. So I've got a picture on the next slide I will show you. Here's an example of no context. So I'm learning Russian at the moment. So you've got the word pelmeni, which means dumplings. So that would be an example of no context, a word translation. Here is an example of context. So you've got skолько let vyššemu synu. Sorry for my pronunciation if anyone is Russian, I'm still learning. And then you've got jemu 24 goda, or 24 if you want to say the actual word for 24. And that means how old is your son? Literally, how many years is your son? He is 24. Literally, he 24 years. The reason this is useful is because if you look at, obviously you might not know this if you're not learning Russian or you don't speak Russian, but the way that sentence is structured is really strange for an English speaker. It's literally saying how many years your son, but it's using it's putting the words your son into a specific way that they don't normally do. Don't worry if that doesn't make sense, but my point is basically when you take chunks like this and look at it, you get an idea of how the language works, and it is so much better for you. So yes, you can take words no context. If you want to take the word for red, for example, like rosso in Italian, and translate it to red, that's going to be fine because it's just the color red. But it is so important that some of your flashcards are chunks and of like sentences and phrases, just so you can get a better idea of how things are actually phrased. Or if you don't do this, it'll come a time when you have to speak or something like that where you can't really, you might know roughly what you want to say. You want to say how old is your son, but you don't really know how to put it into words in a way that will sound normal to a native Russian speaker or whatever language. So yeah, try and implement that if you can. Studying in context is good. Literally just copy what I've done here and you will notice it makes a difference. Number 3, output ASAP. So what do I mean by output? First, I'll explain what I mean by input. Already said it in the last video, but I'll just give you a brief brush up on it. Input is basically content you consume. So anything you can read or listen to. Examples are books, movies, TV, audiobooks, podcasts, music technically, vlogs, like YouTubers' vlogs or anything like that. That's all input because you read it, listen to it, you consume it. Output is the opposite. Output is where you produce content, so to speak, with air quotes about it. So anything you can write or speak, for example, you talking to someone, writing down a paragraph, etc. Me filming this video is technically output in English. So yeah, anything like that. Basically, output is important because you're not just learning a language so you can listen and read in it. You're learning a language so you can write and speak in it as well. You want to be a well-rounded person and you must practice as you play, which is why it is important that when you learn words and you're learning new things, you don't just read them and listen to them, you also say them, write them down, you use them, and that gets you way more familiar with them. It also helps you remember them and put them into your long-term memory, because if you learn something that you never talk about or write down properly, your brain's like, why the hell do I actually need to know this? It's not important, and so it doesn't prioritize it and put it into your long-term memory. So tips to implement output: 1, try journaling every single day, like writing something in the language that you're learning. You can write a paragraph about absolutely nothing. You can write a paragraph about your life. It can be a made-up story, anything like that. And just try and implement new words you learn. So if you read a chapter of a book, learn a bunch of new words, obviously you're going to reread that chapter, but just write like a short paragraph about if the story, like for example, what was it, dumplings? It was a Russian story that just had something to do with dumplings. I could literally write a story about someone who tries to eat a dumpling. It sounds boring, but your story is going to be boring when you don't know that many languages. If you've ever read a story a 4-year-old has written, it's probably not that interesting, and that's basically what you are when you're learning a new language. So yeah, just literally try and do that, and you will find that you make progress so much quicker because all of these words and stuff go into your long-term memory. Tip 2, record yourself reading something and listen back to it. People hate doing that. I don't hate it as much anymore because now I have to put it on the internet and everyone hears it, but is what it is. Or tip 3, respond to simple questions out loud. So you can find comprehension questions about stuff. You can take a quiz. You can write your own questions. Literally just talk in the language and see how long you can go for. If you can just make up a story out loud, you can write the story and then you can read it out loud and record yourself reading it out loud and then listen to it if you want to implement all 3 of them. But yeah, basically just try and implement output as best you can. Number 4, passive to active recall. So yeah, don't worry about trying to remember all of these tips. By the way, you can always come back to this video. You can write them down or whatever. These are just things you can and should do when you're learning vocab because they will help you learn much faster and more efficiently. I try and do all of these things as much as possible. So yeah, basically passive recall is translating from the foreign language into your native language. For example, translating il pane to the bread, which is il pane is Italian. Translating the Italian word to the English word would be passive recall. Active recall is the opposite, where you take a word you know in English and you translate it into its translation in another language. So that would be like taking the bread in English and translating it to il pane in Italian. I've got a little picture down the bottom just to show you as well. So passive recall would be taking geroi in Russian and translating it to hero. Active is the opposite, translating hero in English to geroi in Russian. The reason I bring this up is because passive recall is what most people do, and it is so much easier than active recall. So for example, you've just read a chapter or whatever, you've put the words that you don't know into flashcards, you're looking at the words, you've got the side that the side that you're looking at of the flashcard has all of the words in the language you're learning. So if you're learning Italian, you would have all of the words in Italian, then you try and find out what it is, then you'd flip it back to English to see if you're right. That is easier than active recall. So by all means start with that, but you need to make sure at some point you're hitting the button that allows you to reverse all the flashcards and learn from the other side. There is generally an option for that. I know with Study Stack, which is what I use, you can just press options and press show definition first. Something like that. Just figure it out for whatever flashcard software you use. And yeah, make sure you're doing active recall as well. Reason for this is one, because it makes you a better rounded like studier, for example, and two, because you don't really want to be able to just recognize words. So you might get really good, and I've done this before, I'm guilty of this. You get really good at recognizing words to the point where you can do the entire deck and you can recognize every single word and what it means. But the moment you flip it back, you're like, crap, because you don't really know how to translate the English words into whatever language you're learning, because it's harder and you just haven't done it yet. So you need to make sure you're well-rounded. You need to, once you get kind of reasonably good at passive recall, flip the flashcards and do active recall. It'll be way harder, but you'll get better at it. And then eventually you can go from English to Italian, Italian to English, or English to, whatever language you're learning. So yeah, flip all the flashcards to practice them from the reverse side. Also, writing and journaling again helps you, because it's output, you're writing in another language, so you have to pull the translation from memory. But yeah, number 5, spaced repetition, fairly straightforward. It is a learning strategy where memorization is spaced out. So you learn, the amount of times you learn something, for example, is more frequent at the start, and then as time goes on, you spread it out. This takes advantage of the spacing effect, which is an actual evidence-based thing with learning, where you review something and then you take advantage, you basically review it less and less often, and your brain gets used to it and stores it in long-term memory as useful information. So this isn't something I would obsess over, like trying to go, okay, I'm going to do it 3 times today, and then 2 tomorrow, then 1, then I'm going to skip a day, and then I'm going to learn it and then skip 2 days. Don't really obsess over this. But yeah, just make sure you have the repetition part first. A lot of people learn something, forget it, and then get annoyed and never try and learn it again. You do need to repeat things, otherwise your brain has literally no reason to remember it. Like, seriously think about it. If you remembered every single thing you do without repeating it, the amount of garbage that you would have in your head that you just don't care about, you would literally want a lobotomy, because you would just remember so many things that you just don't want to think about. So it's kind of a good thing. I don't know why I said that. It's kind of a good thing that you only remember things you repeat, and you need to take advantage of that and make sure you are doing repetition with flashcards or anything like that. And yeah, so make sure you have the repetition part. Second, schedule your learning as well. Try and have consistent times you learn, whether it be 3 times a week or every day or whatever. And spaced repetition will just come fairly naturally. So by nature, if you fully memorize a deck of flashcards, you're going to move on to the next one. Excuse me, you're going to move on to the next one just because you want to learn new words. And then obviously just come back to it here and there. And that's basically all you need to do. Spaced repetition isn't something I obsess over that much, to be honest. I just thought it should be included because a lot of people love it and they would burn my house down if I didn't put it in the video. But yeah, there you go. Bonus tip as well, study in the language. This is kind of difficult, so I'll just brush over it quickly. But once you get good enough at a language, you can try and study in the language. So Google, when you're Googling stuff, Google it in the language. Even if it's about the language, you can still Google it in the language. Trust me, you can. Make your flashcard translations, instead of putting the translation in English, like on the other side, put it in the same language, but just an explanation. So I have here acqua, which means water in Italian. Instead of writing water on the other side, I could write cosa bevi da un bicchiere, which means what you drink from a glass. Obviously, if you're good enough to study in the language, you're not going to be translating the word water, because you learned that pretty early on. But you get the picture. That is what I would mean by that. I actually haven't done that second tip. I will put my hand up and say I've never actually done that. I just read that apparently it's useful. So yeah, you can give it a try. And then number 3, I have done, obviously. Put things like your to-do list into the foreign language. And that's just, that's just immersion, basically. The more things you have in the foreign language, the easier it is to start learning things, because you're just used to it. Your brain understands that it has to learn these things to exist, basically. So yeah. Bottom line, guys, sorry for a bit of a longer video, but yeah, implementing all of these tips will give you a huge boost to your speed of learning, which is what we all want at the end of the day. So yeah, if you do like this video, drop a like and subscribe, helps the channel. Makes me feel good about all the time I put in for free. I'm probably going to get cancelled. I feel like I've said, I talked about lobotomies and how people from other countries sound like their ChatGPT. So the channel's definitely getting taken down. I didn't mean anything bad by that, just jokes. But yeah, as always, leave any questions or comments down below. Discord in description, my website in description. Check out both. Leave a comment, not a hate comment preferably, but I don't really care. I think they're funny. And yeah, have a good one, guys. Thank you for watching, and ciao.